I was not supposed to be alive on the morning of March the 3rd. I know how that sounds. I know the particular exhaustion that settles into a reader's eyes when they encounter a sentence like that. The bracing for melodrama, for the cheap currency of near-death confessions traded on the internet for clicks and subscriptions. I understand. I was once that reader, scrolling past testimonies with the mild contempt of a man who has never been cracked open. But I am writing this from the other side of something I cannot name with any word that already exists. And if you will permit me the length of this telling, I believe you will understand why I cannot remain silent. My name is Ezekiel Morn. I am a man who spent 41 years constructing a very specific kind of wall. Not the walls men build from fear or hatred, but the kind built from the far more dangerous material of intellectual certainty. I was an ethno-linguist by training, a skeptic by disposition, and a professional dismantler of other people's metaphysics by reputation. I taught at a small university in the hill country of northern Portugal, in a town called Lamego, where the vineyards terraced down the slopes like sentences in an ancient language no one had finished writing. I lived alone in a house with 1,200 books and a cat named Theorem, and I believed, with the serene confidence of a man who has read too much and suffered too little, that I had correctly mapped the interior of the universe. I was wrong about almost everything. The night it began, I was driving back from a conference in Porto on the cognitive architecture of sacred language, the ways in which religious communities construct meaning through repetition, rhythm, and the strategic deployment of untranslatable terms. I had given a paper that afternoon. I was pleased with it. The applause had been the specific quality of applause I had learned to recognize as genuine rather than polite, and I was doing what I always did after a good performance. I was replaying it in my mind, sharpening the moments that had landed softly, rehearsing better versions of arguments I had already made aloud. It was a Wednesday. The road between Porto and Lamego in the dark is a thing of particular treachery. Not dramatically, not with the operatic cliff faces of coastal roads, but with the quiet malevolence of curves that arrive 3 seconds before your headlights find them. I had driven that road perhaps 200 times. I knew it with the body knowledge of repetition, the way a musician knows a difficult passage not through thought, but through the accumulated memory of 10,000 rehearsals stored in the hands. None of that knowledge was sufficient for what happened at the bridge near the village of Caldas de Aregos. The ice had formed in a strip so narrow and so precisely placed that it could have been deliberate. My front right tire found it at 94 kilometers per hour. I remember the exact sensation. First the wheel going liquid in my hands, then the strange democracy of physics asserting itself over everything I thought I controlled. Then the guardrail arriving at me with the patient inevitability of something that had always been going to happen. The car went through the guardrail. The river below was the Douro, wide, dark, and in March brutally cold. I do not remember the impact with the water. What I remember is the silence that followed it. Not absence of sound, but a different quality of silence, the kind that exists on the other side of sound, the way that sleep exists on the other side of waking, structurally similar, but governed by entirely different laws. I remember the cold as a color rather than a sensation. I remember thinking, with a clarity that had no anxiety attached to it, this is where the road ends. And then I was somewhere else. There is no geography adequate to what I entered. I want to be precise here because precision is what I have always used as my instrument, and I refuse to abandon it merely because the subject matter resists it. The space was not dark. It was not light. It was prior to both, the way that silence is prior to both music and noise. I was present within it with a completeness I had never experienced in my body, not floating, not standing, not anything that requires a body to describe, but there, with the totality of whatever I actually am. And I was not alone. I will not tell you that I saw a face or a figure. I will not tell you that there was a voice in any register that ears could have received. What I will tell you is that there was a presence, and that presence had a quality that I can only approach through negation. It was not indifferent, it was not abstract, it was not the cold mechanical intelligence of the universe that I had spent 41 years constructing arguments in favor of. It was, and here my vocabulary simply gives way beneath me like the ice on that road. It was concerned. Radically, specifically, personally concerned. Not with humanity in the aggregate, not with the species as an interesting evolutionary experiment, but with each granular particular of what it had made. With me. With Ezekiel Morn, the man who named his cat Theorem, and believed that the naming of things was equivalent to the understanding of them. It knew everything I had ever dismissed. And then it showed me something. I want to pause here because what follows is the part that will cost me. I have colleagues, I have a reputation. I have spent a career arguing against exactly the kind of revelation, testimony I am about to offer. And I am aware that this document will be used as evidence of my collapse by people who once cited my papers in their own. I am aware of all of this. I am writing it anyway because the alternative, the careful maintenance of an intellectual position I no longer hold, feels like a betrayal more complete than anything my critics could inflict. What the presence showed me was not a vision in the cinematic sense. It was not images. It was something closer to the experience of suddenly knowing something you have always somehow known but refused to surface. Like remembering, not learning. Like a curtain moved aside rather than a window constructed. It showed me black people, not as a category, not as a demographic, not as the subject of any discourse I had ever participated in, academic or otherwise. It showed me, and here I am going to be very slow because I do not want to collapse this into the language of sentimentality, which would be a falsification. It showed me what black people carry, the specific weight of it, the particular texture and mass of a burden that is not merely historical but ontological, meaning it has been pressed so deep into the structure of daily experience that it operates below the level of grievance, below the level of articulation, in the place where the body simply knows what the world has decided about it before a single word is exchanged. I am a white man. I grew up in Swansea, in a family of modest intellectual ambition and genuine emotional limitation. My engagement with questions of race had been, until that night on the Douro, the engagement of a man who believes that understanding something analytically is equivalent to knowing it. I had read Fanon. I had assigned Achille Mbembe to graduate students. I had written 2 sentences in a footnote of my second book about the relationship between colonial language policy and the suppression of African oral traditions. And I had considered this sufficient. The presence did not critique me, it did not indict me. What it did was more disorienting than either of those things. It showed me, it placed me, and I cannot explain the mechanics of this, only the fact of it. It placed me inside the continuous experience of being black in a world designed by people who had decided, long before the current century, that blackness was a problem to be managed rather than a humanity to be encountered. Not as metaphor, not as thought experiment, inside. What frightened me, and I use that word not for dramatic effect, but because it is the only accurate one, was not the suffering itself, though the suffering was real and specific and annihilating in its particularity. What frightened me was the resilience. That is the word that is going to make some readers close this document, because resilience has been used so often as a compliment that it has lost its actual meaning, which is terrifying. To be resilient means that you have encountered something that should have broken you and found in yourself some structure that held. What the presence showed me was that black people have had to develop, across generations, across continents, across languages, across every conceivable context of dehumanization, an interior architecture so sophisticated, so load-bearing, so elaborately reinforced, that it constitutes nothing less than a parallel civilization of the self. I do not mean this poetically. I mean it the way I mean things when I mean them precisely. That the interior resources required to navigate daily life as a black person in a world that has never stopped deciding what to do with you, those resources represent an achievement of human development so significant that it should have reorganized every discipline I have ever worked in. It should be at the center of philosophy. It should be at the center of psychology. It should be at the center of every conversation about what human beings are capable of. Instead, it is a footnote. 2 sentences, like mine. The presence did not tell me this with anger. This is the part I keep returning to, in the months since the river and the guardrail and the impossible stillness. There was no anger. There was something I can only call grief that has been transmuted, the way that extreme pressure transmutes carbon, changing it into something that retains the original material while becoming an entirely different substance. The presence grieved what had been done, and it grieved the waste, not primarily of suffering, which is terrible enough, but of everything that suffering had been forced to consume. All the human energy that could have built worlds if it had not been required to defend the basic legitimacy of existing. It showed me individual faces. I will not describe them because they are not mine to describe, but I saw them. I saw the man who spent his entire life being twice as good and receiving half as much, and who died knowing his children would begin the same calculation. I saw the woman who had learned to make herself smaller in rooms where she had more knowledge than anyone present, because her presence at full size would be interpreted as aggression. I saw the children who had been taught, before they were old enough to understand why, that the world required a performance of them that it did not require of other children, and who had performed magnificently and then had been told that their performance was suspicious. I saw genius perpetually auditioned. I saw grace perpetually conditional. I saw love that had been forced to exist in the cracks of a structure that was never built to accommodate it, and that had grown there anyway, stubborn and extraordinary, like a tree through concrete. And the presence showed me something else, something that sits with me still, that I carry like a stone in my chest, not because it is oppressive, but because it is heavy with implication. It showed me what the world has lost. I do not know how long I was in that river. The rescue workers told me later it was 11 minutes from the moment a shepherd named Custodio Vranas saw my headlights disappear through the guardrail to the moment they pulled me onto the bank. 11 minutes in the Douro in March is, by the cold mathematics of physiology, not a duration that admits survivors. The hypothermia alone should have been complete. The impact alone should have been sufficient. Custodio Vranas was 73 years old and had been out that night because one of his animals had gone toward the river. He was not supposed to be there. He called the emergency services from a mobile phone he had only recently been persuaded to carry by his granddaughter, who is 12 years old and apparently more capable than her grandfather of anticipating disaster. He pulled me out himself. 73 years old. He sat with me on the bank and he spoke to me in Portuguese that I was too far gone to process, but which I have since been told was a kind of continuous improvised prayer, not formal, not liturgical, but the specific prayer of a man who has been in close proximity to the edge of things often enough to know the address. I was in hospital in Villarreal for 19 days. I had 4 broken ribs, a fracture in my left clavicle, water in both lungs, and a hypothermia that the attending physician, a woman named Dr. Rafaela Coutim, described to me with the careful understatement of someone who has learned to deliver miracles as though they were administrative matters. I did not tell anyone in the hospital what I had experienced in the river. I am a careful man. I needed time with it first, time to turn it over, to probe it the way I probe an argument, looking for the seams where it might split under pressure. I spent 19 days in a hospital bed doing what I have always done, trying to find the flaw in the structure. I could not find it. When I returned to Lamego, to my house with its 1,200 books and theorem, who received me with the specific indifference of a cat who has been managed in your absence by a neighbor and has revised his opinion of your centrality accordingly, when I returned, I sat for a long time in my study without turning on any lights. The books around me had a different quality than before. They were still there, still everything I had read, still the architecture of the person I had built. But they had the quality now of a map of a place I had visited without them. They described the territory. They were not the territory. I thought about my footnote. 2 sentences. I began to write. I want to be careful about what I am claiming and what I am not claiming. I am not claiming that what I experienced constitutes proof of any particular theology. I am not claiming that my experience in that river is transferable or that it grants me any authority over the experience of black people, or that my understanding, however it has been altered, is equivalent to the understanding that comes from living inside that reality rather than having it shown to you from outside, however completely, for however long. I am claiming only this. Something happened to me that night that I cannot explain through any framework I previously possessed. And what it showed me, specifically, particularly, insistently, was not an abstraction. It was not a principle. It was human beings. Black human beings. The weight they carry. The genius they have been required to develop in conditions designed to prevent its development. The loss, not theirs, but ours, all of ours, the collective loss of what the world might have been if it had chosen differently. I am a white man who went into a river on a Wednesday in March and came out on the other side of something I cannot name. And the something I cannot name chose, of all the things it could have shown me, to show me that. I have been asking myself why ever since. The answer I keep returning to, and I offer it with the tentativeness that this kind of answer deserves, is that I was shown it because I was precisely the kind of person who needed to be shown. The kind of person whose intellectual engagement with injustice had been so complete and so bloodless that it had become a form of insulation. I had understood racism the way you can understand the physics of drowning without ever having been in water. And something, whatever the presence was, whatever name it answers to or refuses, something decided that understanding of that quality was no longer acceptable from me. It was not a punishment. It was an education. Since returning from Villarreal, I have done things that my former self would have found melodramatic and professionally embarrassing. I have sat in rooms where black scholars and writers and artists spoke about their work, and I have listened with a quality of attention that I did not previously know I was capable of. Not the attentiveness of a researcher cataloging data, but the attention that you give to something that is trying to tell you where the road actually goes. I have read differently. I have been in conversations that cracked me open in ways that felt each time like a smaller version of that river. The same loss of control, the same sudden irrelevance of everything I thought I knew about navigation. I have called Custodio Vranas. We speak on the phone improbably, in a mixture of his Portuguese and my broken attempt at it. He does not ask me what I experienced. He tells me about his animals. He tells me about his granddaughter, who has now decided she wants to study marine biology. He tells me about the weather on the slopes above the Douro. He is the least dramatic person I have ever known, and I love him with a specificity and completeness that I could not have felt before the river. His granddaughter's name is Inesinha. She is 12 years old. She lives in a country that will require her to prove things about herself that it does not require of her male classmates or her white classmates. She wants to study the ocean, and she will probably have to want it harder than anyone should have to want anything, just to be allowed to study it in the same rooms as the people who want it less. I think about her when I think about the faces the presence showed me. I think about the architecture she is already building inside herself, whether she knows it or not. The reinforcements, the load-bearing structures, the systems for managing a world that has already made certain decisions about her before she has done a single thing to deserve them. I think about what she will carry, and what the world will never know it lost if it refuses her. I have told this story only twice before writing it down. Once to Dr. Rafaela Coutim, who received it with the equanimity of someone who has watched enough people come back from the edge to have stopped requiring their returns to be explicable. And once to a former student of mine named Absalom Dre, who is black, and who was quiet for a long time after I finished, and then said something that I have been carrying since. It's interesting that it had to almost kill you to get you to pay attention. He said it without bitterness. He said it the way you say a true thing. He was right. That is perhaps the most frightening thing the river showed me. Not what is being done, and not even what is being lost, but how much it costs to get people like me to simply look. The price of our attention. The extraordinary lengths that reality must go to in order to interrupt the comfortable management of a conscience that has mistaken analysis for action and footnotes for witness. I am writing this down because I cannot find any other way to make it matter at a sufficient scale. I am writing it in English in a country where I am a foreigner, about an experience that has made me feel foreign to myself in a way that I am, slowly, beginning to recognize as the beginning of something more honest than anything I was before. The road between Porto and Lamego is repaired now. The guardrail has been replaced. There is no visible evidence from the road of what happened there. You would drive past the spot and know nothing. The Douro below is the same river it has always been, neither proud nor apologetic about what it almost kept. I go back sometimes. I stand at the new guardrail and look at the water, and I try to remember the quality of that silence. Not to return to it, but to keep it accessible, the way you keep a compass accessible, not because you want to be lost, but because you remember what it was to be. It showed me black people and called it frightening. But I understand now that the fright was mine. The fright belonged to the part of me that had been comfortable, and comfort, faced with truth of that magnitude, registers it first as threat. What it showed me was not frightening. What it showed me was extraordinary. What it showed me was the specific, irreducible, load-bearing extraordinariness of people who have had to become extraordinary just to be ordinary, and who have done it, generation after generation, in the face of every institutional and interpersonal mechanism designed to make it impossible, with a grace that the world has never stopped trying to take credit for, while refusing to acknowledge the cost. I stood before something I cannot name, and it showed me what I had been refusing to see. I am still learning to see it. I expect I will be learning for whatever remains of the road. If this cracked something open in you, don't leave alone. Subscribe to this channel. Thousands already in this journey trust it. Like this video, that simple act tells the algorithm someone else needs to hear this. And drop in the comments, what city are you listening from? You'd be surprised who else is there.